So yeah, as you said, if you're in mobile marketing, I think we've all been affected by fraud in some way, and I'll keep it top line here. So I'll go over what is mobile fraud, how to identify it, and how to counter it. I've put two types of mobile fraud, the classic and the modern fraud techniques. I'll just be going over the classic ones. I think they're the most common ones that you'll find. And understanding these type of activity, if you're new to it, it will be the same in the modern fraud techniques. A lot of it is covered quite well by your mobile measurement partner and their their fraud prevention suites. But it's still worth noting. It's still worth noting how to identify it, because inevitably some will slip through the cracks. Also, the modern fraud techniques can be very hard to define, unless you're looking at user cohorts on a monthly basis, post-install events, big data. And unless you're a very big spender in the game, it won't be too relevant. And if you're a very big spender in the game, I assume you've got your ways of dealing with it. So just to categorize it in an intro, there's two main types of fraud. The attribution fraud, which is stealing last click from legitimate installs. And there's event install spoofing, so generating events and installs from thin air. If you're running mobile marketing campaigns, I guarantee you've been the victim of fraud. You will 100% have paid for fraudulent activity. Obviously, this does happen across all channels and all forms of display advertising, web included. But for the moment, I'm just going to focus on in-app traffic. And what is fraud? Just a very simple definition. Any type of activity which you pay for the services you do not receive, but it is framed as if you do so. So attribution fraud, obviously falsely attributing the efforts of paid activity to organic users or people that would have been your customers anyway, those who were going to install your app or who were in the process of installing. Event spoofing or install spoofing are faked installs that are sent to your mobile measurement provider and make you pay for a CPI that didn't exist. Now, I assume everyone who's running mobile marketing campaigns is using some form of mobile measurement partner to track their activity. I mean, if not, you should be. But often they will have their own ways in-house of dealing with fraud and will claim to have bulletproof fraud prevention. Sadly, it's not quite true, although most of them are pretty good. And just an intro, 100 billion apps were downloaded on Android and iOS in 2017. It's estimated that 20 billion passed through tracking providers. That's not necessarily paid, just passed through a provider, such as Adjust, Kachava, AppsFlyer. That means that most installs are coming organically, which means these are great people to target because they're real. The post-install events will be real. And they'll be highly motivated to use your app if they've downloaded it organically. Oh yes, because this was a in-house presentation, there's some cheesy memes and GIFs, just ignore it. So just a few stats, 4.6 billion, a pretty conservative estimate of app install fraud losses, 2018. You're most at risk if you run CPI or CPA campaigns. We find that especially casino or gambling apps are highly targeted due to the high CPIs. If you're paying above $10 per install, you're a good target. It's not so much worth targeting the low CPI installs. Obviously, fraud covers banking and stuff. I'm just talking about advertising here today. So let's start with number one, the classic fraud types. Click spam. This is one of the most famous types of fraudulent activity you'll find. What is click spam? Click spam is organic, so it's making sure you're targeting organic users. Why is that great? Because all of the post-install events and financial indicators will be real. And what's the method of doing it? Multiple methods. It's essentially generating lots of clicks that didn't exist. Can be done while you're watching a video on mobile web. These clicks can be generated in the background. In-app inventory clicks can be generated from pre-installed infected apps, battery savers, memory cleaners, flashlight apps, etc. Ad stacking, cookie stacking. And auto redirects, I'm sure we've all had the situation in app where we've clicked on an ad or something similar and a window has appeared and then vanished. That will have been a forcible redirect, and that will have counted as a click, and whichever network ran that will now have the attribution stolen as a click. Ultimately, you land via the deep link to the app that you wanted to open, or the respective Google Play, iTunes store, if you so wanted. So you don't think anything of it, but the click has been generated. Sorry, got a bit of a cough. So there was a famous case, I think you heard of Cheetah Mobile. If you haven't heard of this, just Google Cheetah Mobile BuzzFeed, where it was apps that generated battery savers and things like this that had over 2 billion installs, which turned out to be just a massive front for attribution stealing. And this can be an example of the malware apps that you can download. And what are the indicators that click spamming is affecting your campaigns? iOS is more at risk, simply the less number of devices, higher statistical probability that you're going to get hit, also higher CPIs on iOS. A high number of clicks in relation to installs. Obviously, click spamming generates a lot of clicks. If you have a lot of clicks and a low conversion rate to install, that's one indicator. Obviously, it's worth noting different formats, video, banners, things like this have different conversion rates, so does not necessarily indicate fraud to watch out for. But the main one we're going to be talking about is abnormal TTI, the time to install. So obviously the fraudsters do not know when this organic user is going to install an app, so they need to keep hitting them with lots of clicks. And we'll see this in the graphs later. It creates a long tail TTI. A solution: flag low conversion rate sources and watch for this long tail distribution, which we'll see in the next slide. So here are two networks. These are real networks. I've hidden their names because that's not important. And what this is analyzing the installs in relation to the click. So day 0 is the customers that have installed on the same day as clicking on an ad. Obviously, logically, most of the installs should come from the click that was generated in the same day. I mean, I can't remember what I had for dinner like 3 days ago, so I'm not going to remember the ad that I clicked on 3 days ago and go back and install. And we can see network Y here on the left, 86% of users installed the ad on the same day the click was generated. That makes sense, and then you can see a sort of standard progression, lowering, getting to day 6, when it's almost negligible. And then we see network X, which is a bit suspicious. It seems to be pretty random, the installs that come on the days post-click. And this highlights it better in a graph. Why I've chosen 7 days. Most mobile measurement providers will have a standard attribution window of 7 days. So you click on an ad, you are attributed to that network. And if you install the app within 7 days, the install will be attributed to that network. The network will get paid the CPI for that. If you don't install within 7 days, you usually get shifted back to organic. And so you can see here what should be on the left, network Y, a standard tail off after the first day of install, and then network X. This is what's called the long tail distribution. Lots of clicks are generated. They don't know when the install will occur, on what day after the click, so it is random. And we have a table here. This was real networks that I used in just 1 month of activity. You can see network X, very high amount of clicks, low amount of installs, low conversion rate. This would indicate click spamming. And you can see compared to network Y, much higher conversion rate. I would also say from personal experience that programmatic campaigns seem to have less fraud. This could in part be because you can see the apps and the inventory names directly. Therefore, if you detect fraudulent activity from a source, you can blacklist it. If you see puzzles and words is generating a lot of clicks, suspicious amount, You can blacklist it from not just that campaigns, all your campaigns in all your geos. But if you're just given an ID, it's more difficult. I think also the nature of real-time bidding gives less time and opportunity for fraudsters to implement a click. Okay, so we'll go on to the second type, click injection. It's pretty similar. The method is attribution stealing, so you're trying to poach organic users. The aim is to steal organic and non-fraudulent traffic. You'll also be stealing traffic from other channels as well. Again, this often happens with real apps that are embedded with malware. Their aim is to infect as many devices as possible, and they'll even see paid activity promoting apps just for the sole purpose of spreading malware. This is how profitable it can be. And a notable case, as I said, Cheetah Mobile. Definitely recommend Googling it if you haven't heard about it. Very interesting case. And there's no real repercussions. They took the apps down and they're back on the App Store within 3 months. So this is definitely something that the Google Play Store and iTunes need to tackle. It's predominantly going to be seen on Android, but that has been fixed since I actually wrote this presentation. And that's the method. It's just injecting a click. Once the install begins, the attribution has been stolen. Before the app is opened, which is then usually when the app launch is when the tracking SDK is initialized and the install is counted, a click has been generated and the attribution has been changed. So why this is no longer a problem in Android is they've implemented the Android API referrer with Google, which then adds 2 parameters to your tracking, which is the referrer click timestamp, which is a timestamp which logs when the click was generated, and an install begin timestamp. So that logs when the install actually starts to begin on your device. A few months ago, this didn't exist, but now it exists in Android. So any click which is generated after the beginning of the install is obviously fraudulent and can now be rejected quite easily. If you have updated your mobile measurement partner, then this should no longer be a problem for you on Android. But it's still worth noting because similar techniques are still in use. And this is a good graph which indicates the time to install distribution. You can see anything too early on, if you start to have a click or an install immediately, if the install is generated immediately after the click, usually it takes 15 seconds to click on an app, click on the ad, go to the Play Store and download. Anything lower than that is pretty suspicious. Then that is pretty obvious. Okay, let's go to the next one. This is bots. Apologies for the terrible Terminator GIF. Couldn't help the Skynet reference. So obviously, what are bots? It's now the second part of fraudulent activity. This is no longer stealing organic installs. This is completely spoofed installs. So this is apps that are installed not on actual devices or people's devices, but emulators. If ever you've played Game Boy on your phone or PlayStation on your computer, you'll be familiar with emulators. The info about the install is then sent to your tracking provider, and it will come up in your mobile measurement partner, in AppFollow or something, one install, which didn't really exist. They're quite clever. They can create artificial parameters to go along with it. So the install will come in with a legitimate device ID, with a legitimate OS version. All of this is pretty clever, so if you look into it, it looks quite real. And what are the indicators that you may be susceptible to this kind of fraudulent activity? Again, if you have high CPIs, you're more likely to be targeted by the more advanced bots. And the significant anomalies in post-install events. Obviously, this will be a spoofed install. It won't be a real user. So what does that mean? That means there'll be no actual cohort to this user. There'll be no real purchase or any kind of post-install events after that. So that's one thing to look out for. It may not be obvious from the install itself that it's fraudulent. It may not be blocked upon install, but then anything after that you can retroactively find out. One thing worth mentioning though is it's not just installs which can be spoofed. It is post-install events. So a post-install event would be any logical event within your user journey. Usually you're optimizing towards one specific event. Your install isn't your end game. I assume most of us are optimizing towards a purchase or a sign-up kind of event. And these can also be spoofed. It's just a server-to-server ping. If you have the correct URL server destination, if you have the correct event token for that event, which a fraudster can often get just by debugging your app. There are some very simple proxies that you can do. If you download a tool like Charles Proxy, you can debug your app. And unless you're hiding your event tokens, a lot of big apps surprisingly aren't, then it's easy to get and you can add it into a URL, ping it to the server, and you have created an artificial event. Well, why would someone do this? Why would someone spoof a post-install event if you're paying on a CPI? Well, it's to legitimize the fraud. If you have an additional 10,000 installs in 1 month, but the order volume remains the same, then it would be instantly suspicious. But if the order volume increases in proportion, then everything looks in order. This is something that happens quite a lot. You might think it's obvious anyway, but unless you're checking your mobile measurement partner installs to your Google Developers Console or iTunes Store, for example, it may not be completely obvious. And unless you're checking your mobile measurement provider orders or events to your backend, it can be easy for these things to slip through the net if done in proportion. These are the device farms. Let me just quickly go over the solution. The solution is obviously to cross-reference your install numbers to legitimate install numbers. Check backend data against your events. That can be a pain in the ass. Or check if other post-install events were populated. For example, if you're optimizing towards order event and you get installs and orders, but then a suspiciously low amount of view vendor or launch the app events, then something doesn't quite add up. Also, you can see a lot of post-install events grouped by one device ID. When I found out about this type of fraud last year, I checked on BigQuery on our backend, and I checked order events grouped by device ID, and we found that one device ID had 90 acquisitions. So that was obviously instantly very suspicious. Also, you'll see, I saw in one market they usually got about 30,000 installs per month. Organically, 1 month it had 250,000 installs, which was instantly a bit suspicious. And the next one we'll go over is device farms. I'll try and be quick. This is just an actual device farm, what it looks like, not mining Bitcoin. They are mostly Android due to the low price, easier software to hack. You can change the advertising identifier. Obviously, one install is linked to the Google Play Store advertising ID, the GPS AD-ID for Android, or the IDFA, the identifier for advertisers on iOS devices. And if you just swap those over, then you can generate installs that look unique with one bit of software, basically. Something that would look like Raspberry Pi. Wider choices of models, but iOS farms do still exist. Again, they connect to publishers, constant monitoring of available apps, or available paid activity to run their ads and get the CPIs. Often the network's not complicit in this, it's just very difficult to find out. And they will try and populate parameters, but this is where they can be found out, as they are not very good at it. If they're very clever, they can run matrices to use artificial intelligence to try and get an idea of what parameters should be populated. Only if you're spending a lot of money on mobile advertising, will this really be a huge impact for you? The indicators, what indicates you may be susceptible to this. One problem is that most of the mobile measurement partners' anti-fraud solutions are open source, and you can see them on GitHub. Therefore, they can be reverse engineered. If you see a spike in organic installs, often installs which have been rejected may end up in organic. So it's good to keep an eye on if you see an overall rise of organic installs. It looks suspicious. And again, keep an eye out from numerous installs from one phone model, numerous installs from one IP address. If they're often using a VPN, that's one thing to group them by. And new installs by device ID. This is always a good thing to run. I was shocked when I looked at our data. We have a pretty advanced fraud, anti-fraud prevention suite that our company pays a lot of money for, and even we were suffering from a lot of this. So it's definitely worth looking into your data, open that Pandora's box. Again, not always easy to find just from the install itself that it's fraudulent. This is why some mobile measurement providers flag installs as suspicious to be reviewed later. And the last one is incentivized installs. This might not actually be fraudulent in the traditional sense, but when I'm running campaigns, I tend not to do incentivized installs because people don't tend to be interested in your apps. What are incentivized installs? Incentivized installs are downloads coming from users who receive a various in-app reward of various forms for the installs taking place. I'm sure we're all familiar with this. A lot of gaming apps use this. But in order to counter this, it's best you just talk to your DSP or your network provider on limiting this. Say you specifically do not want this, you will not pay for installs like this, unless you think it's okay, but these tend to skew your install data, and these customers tend to just leave the app and don't engage with it. They're not really too interested. How can you spot it? Obviously, very high conversion rate. Could be diluted by additional clicks, but most don't bother. And obviously everything apart from that will look real, so it's pretty hard to identify. It's just you've got to choose. It's up to you whether you want to go for these kind of things or not. That will be a simple graph looking at incentivized installs, a lot of installs, but no post-install activity. And thank you for your attention. I think I'm almost out of time. One thing I would say, though, is something that I think we all struggle with is mobile marketers. There's no unifying definition of what is fraud in mobile marketing. Each mobile measurement partner defines fraud in their own way. And for example, what you see as fraud in a Just Apps flyer could be different to what you're using in another mobile measurement provider. And in other industries, there's usually like one unifying board which defines what fraud is, and then we can start to tackle it on an industry-wide basis. But until we have that kind of more bipartisan collaboration approach, it's going to be very difficult for all of us to tackle fraud in a unique way. So I would invite everyone to push their mobile measurement partner to define what is fraud and make it open source.